ancient Egyptian fashion, what comes to mind? Opulent images of Cleopatra in a flowing white dress ornamented with gold and precious jewels, the glamorous crowns and striped headdresses of the pharaoh. Maybe you dressed as an ancient Egyptian for Halloween or a school project when you were a kid. Perhaps you think of movies you watched that fused old Hollywood glamour with Egyptian influences, or the characters in your favorite childhood cartoons, such as the Prince of Egypt or Scooby-Doo. Egypt has become a mainstay in our popular culture, and with it comes depictions of their clothing. While their fashion has become highly recognizable, the processes behind the creation of these garments rarely gets discussed. When we look at finished items of clothing, the work that went into them may not seem immediately obvious. So let's learn more. Clothes today are made out of many different materials and fabrics, but most ancient Egyptian clothing was made out of linen. Linen is a fabric that comes from plants, specifically flax plants. Flax plants are not native to Egypt, which may seem surprising, but they were introduced at some point in the prehistoric period and have been grown in Egypt since. So you might be wondering, how does a plant turn into a piece of clothing? Well, within the stem of the flax plant, there are fibers that can be spun and woven to make cloth. These fibers are sandwiched between the outer layer, called the epidermis, and the central veins, known as the phloem and xylem. Before these special fibers could be used, the plants themselves needed to be grown. Being in the middle of a desert, Egypt doesn't seem like a great place for growing plants. That's where the Nile River becomes super important. Every year, the Nile would flood. Typically, we associate floods with disaster and destruction, but it was quite the opposite in Egypt. The floods left behind tons of fertile soil that was perfect for growing a bunch of plants. This flooding often took place between June and September, and the seeds would be planted around mid-November after all the fertile soil had been deposited. The Egyptians prepared the ground by using groups of oxen that pulled a plow. These oxen were basically the tractors of the ancient era. Then, seeds would be scattered on top. Officials carefully watched the spreading of flax seeds and recorded the amount that was planted. To make sure the seeds were buried within the soil instead of just sitting on top, a flock of sheep followed to trample them into the ground. The flax took about 3 months to grow before it was ready to be harvested. Depending on when the plants were gathered, the fibers could be used to make different types of cloth. If the plants were still young and green, the fibers would be good for making a thin cloth. When it was slightly older, they were better for making a more general fabric. Once the plants were old, the fibers were only used for rough textiles and rope. Ancient Egyptians harvested flax plants by simply grabbing a handful and pulling. Other plants like wheat had to be cut with a curved blade called a sickle, but flax was pulled by hand to get the longest and straightest fibers they could. Once pulled, they would be tied into bundles and laid to dry in the sun. After they fully dried, the seed heads at the top needed to be removed. There were multiple ways this could be done. Some simply did it by hand, while others used a comb or a board. The stems would be pulled through a set of teeth, and the heads would fall into a pile underneath. You can imagine it being like combing through your hair to remove a tangle. Seeds were used to create oil, so they wouldn't go to waste. After the seed heads had been removed, the stems were left to rot to get rid of the outer bark. This was done by placing the flax into slowly moving water for about 10 to 14 days until the bark rotted away. After the stems dried once more, any remaining hard bits were removed through a process called scutching. This was when the flax fibers would be beaten with a wooden fan or bat to shake out the loose pieces, but some people chose instead to pass them between 2 sticks held in their hand. After scutching, someone turned the fibers into organized sections. This action, called roving, was done by rolling the fibers on the thigh or on a semicircle base in front of them. Once the fibers were prepared, they were spun into thread. Spinning combined multiple fibers into one strong and continuous thread. Using a spindle, like this example from the New Kingdom, workers twisted the fibers into tighter and stronger threads. Multiple threads could be spun together to make a thicker yarn. This was called plying. To prevent them from unraveling, the fibers were spun while they were moist. Spinners could moisten the fibers by wetting the fingers, dampening the entire ball of thread, or passing the fibers through the mouth to coat them with spit. After the thread was spun, it needed to be woven together to make fabric. The process began with creating parallel lines across the weaving loom, which were called warp threads. Then, the weaver would pass another strand of thread, called the weft, over and under these warp threads. The most common weave used for clothing in the New Kingdom period was the basket weave. This is where the weft was woven between the warp in groups of 2 or more. There were 2 main types of looms, the ground or horizontal loom, and the vertical or fixed beam loom. The ground loom stretched the warp threads between 2 beams held in place by pegs in the ground. The length of the cloth made on the ground looms remained limited to the amount of threads spun, because the warp threads would be wrapped around the beam. A way to identify cloth made on a ground loom was from the looped fringe on the left side. In contrast, as the name suggests, the vertical loom stretched the warp threads vertically instead of horizontally. Until the New Kingdom period, the ground loom was the only type used. Vertical looms were most likely introduced by other cultures from the Near East, but the ground loom was not totally replaced and continued to be used. Weaving was a task done by both men and women. However, in ancient Egyptian art, women were typically depicted using ground looms, and only men were shown operating the vertical looms. Once the fabric had been made by the weavers, it could be cut and sewn into clothing. While modern clothes are made up of lots of differently shaped pieces, ancient Egyptian garments were usually made out of basic rectangles. There were 2 main types of clothing in Egypt, wraparound and cut to shape. The wraparound garments included kilts, skirts, and some dresses. These clothes were simply lengths of cloth that would be wrapped around the body in different ways. Kilts and skirts followed the same general patterns for construction. They were hemmed rectangles of fabric that would be wrapped around the body and tucked into the top. They looked very similar to how someone might wrap a towel around themselves today. Kilts could be decorated using fringe, tassels, and pleats. However, women's skirts lacked these extra decorations. In the New Kingdom era, sash kilts became more popular. These kilts were constructed in a similar manner, but differed in the wrapping techniques. The kilt was tied into a knot in the front, and the ends would either be tucked in or allowed to hang down the front. In terms of dresses, there were multiple types of wraparound gowns. The simple wraparound dresses would be circled around the body between 1 and 3 times depending on how much fabric there was. These dresses could be worn with or without shoulder straps. These straps were not attached to the rest of the dress. Instead, they were placed over the shoulder and then the dress would be wrapped over top. There were also complex wraparound dresses that began to emerge in the New Kingdom period. Similar to the sash kilts, these dresses used knots instead of tucking and could be made from 1 or 2 lengths of cloth. Here are 3 examples of potential ways that the complex wraparound dress could be tied. The second type of ancient Egyptian clothing was cut-to-shape garments, which included loincloths and bag tunics. For these clothes, the edges were sewn down, and they were fastened with string ties. The loincloth was one of the most widely worn clothing items in ancient Egypt. Part of the garment was wrapped around the waist, and the rest would be pulled between the legs. Loincloths were versatile pieces that could be worn alone or under other clothing. They were usually made of 2 triangle-shaped pieces sewn together at the straight edges in the center, and there are typically 2 strings at the upper corners to help tie the loincloth around the waist. Bag tunics were long rectangles folded in half and sewn up the sides to create a bag-shaped garment, hence the name. Men and women alike wore the long bag tunics that covered the body from the shoulders down to the calf or ankle, but men were also depicted wearing half-bag tunics which only reached down to the hips or knees. Similar to the loincloths, these tunics could be worn by themselves or with other garments. The tunics had a hole for the head and a slit that goes down the front for the neck. Sleeves could also be added where the holes had been left on the side seams. You may be wondering, what tools did they use to cut and sew ancient clothing? Ancient Egyptians used metal scissors or knives to cut the woven cloth. These surviving metal shears were from the Roman period and show the spring scissors that Egyptians used. Shears designed like this are still used today. Sewing machines didn't exist in ancient times, so all the sewing would have been done by hand. Needles were made from wood, bone, copper, bronze, silver, or gold. They tended to be larger than modern needles, but they could still be made small enough to sew fine fabric and details. They also used thread made out of flax, similar to what the fabric itself would be made out of. Thimbles could be used to push needles through difficult fabric. There is only one known example of a surviving thimble from ancient Egypt, but it doesn't exactly look like a modern thimble. This sandstone tool is thought to have been worn over the middle finger and would have been held in place by the neighboring fingers. The hole in the center was likely caused by long-term use, where the needles wore the thimble down over time. Once the clothing had been made and worn, what did they do when it got dirty? Ancient Egyptians thought that cleanliness was super important, and stainless white garments may have been seen as an indication of social status and personal hygiene. This meant that Egyptians regularly did their laundry. In lower-class households, women likely performed the washing on the riverbanks of the Nile. However, professional washermen also existed for the elites. Because washing machines hadn't been invented yet, all the washing was done by hand. The dirty linens would get soaked in the river or in a bucket, and then rubbed with a soap called natron. Natron also had ingredients that bleached the fabric. The wet cloth would be beaten or rubbed with wooden clubs against a stone base and then rinsed. To wring out the extra water, the cloth would be wrapped around a wooden post and twisted. To fully dry, the clothes would be laid out in the sun, which also helped the bleaching process. Laundry marks on clothing sent to professional washermen were used to identify who the garments belonged to. It was basically the same as writing your name in your underwear. These marks could have been made with permanent ink, embroidered details, or a small mark woven into the fabric itself. What did they do if their clothes got worn out? Because of the expense and labor involved in creating new clothing, ancient Egyptians would repair their clothes rather than replace them. A process called darning would create new warp and weft threads using a needle and thread to fill holes in the fabric. Less frequently, patches were used to strengthen areas that had worn down with use. When we look at an item of clothing, we often forget all the work that goes into the process of creating it. Ancient Egyptians would have dreamed of technology like tractors, sewing machines, and washing machines to get rid of some of the extra work. While techniques and technology have changed since ancient times, our modern clothing creation follows many of these same steps. You may even have an item of clothing in your closet inspired by the wraparound dresses or bag tunics of ancient times. We often think of ancient fashion as being outdated, but it may be more familiar than we ever imagined.